Once you start putting materials on a surface, you are essentially creating a composition, which is the arrangement of the elements of art on a given work. Just as a refresher, the elements of art are color, line, shape, texture, value, space, and form. Now, we need to be aware of how these elements are interacting with the space and with each other in order to create a composition with a sense of balance. To create balance in an image, you need to remember everything on the page is going to carry visual weight. You also need to remember that everything on the page will affect everything else. Try to think about a balanced composition like a seesaw. You don't want it to tip over. If one side carries too much visual weight, the visual seesaw will start to tip in that direction, creating an unbalanced composition. With this composition, the three circles are evenly placed, creating a symmetrical composition. If you were to draw a line down the center axis of the composition, the elements would be the same on both sides. This creates symmetry. Symmetry is created when the elements precisely correspond to either a vertical or a horizontal axis. Here's an example of a vertical axis composition, where the elements on the right and the left of the composition are reflective of each other. Here's an example of a horizontal axis composition, with the elements on the top and the bottom of the composition are reflective of each other. In most artwork that utilizes symmetrical composition, the elements aren't 100% precise, but the concept roughly applies. This application of symmetry is often referred to as approximate symmetry. Symmetry is often used to give focus, thus importance, to the elements on the axis line. Symmetry can be used to give a composition a sense of order. It's important to remember that there is no preordained result from using symmetry. With that said, in general, artists have used it to create a central focus, order, and sometimes a state of calmness. Symmetry has its uses, but it can also be limiting. Often, to create compositions with more tension, artists have utilized asymmetrical balance. Asymmetrical balance is achieved when dissimilar elements have equal visual weight. Before we look further into asymmetrical design, it would be useful to examine this idea of visual weight. If we limit our analysis to a single object, we can change the visual weight of that object in a number of ways. We can change the scale of that object. We can make it larger, and we can make it smaller. We can change the orientation. Vertical and horizontal lines tend to show a state of rest. Tilting the object can suggest movement and tension. We can change the color of the object in a number of ways. We can change the value from light to dark. We can change the hue to different colors on the spectrum. We can also change the saturation or the intensity of that color. This is just the beginning of how we can alter elements to change their visual weight. Visual weight can also be changed by the complexity of an element, from simple to complex. Visual weight can be changed by our association. If we associate an element with a letter, a symbol, or an object, that element may carry more visual weight than a non-objective element, which doesn't represent any specific idea. It's important to note that visual weight will also be different for each viewer. Someone who reads English will identify letters very differently when compared to a viewer who is used to reading Chinese characters. This concept of visual weight starts to get really complex when these elements start to interact with each other. Visual weight can also be drastically changed with an element's location on the composition, which leads back to the discussion involving asymmetrical balance. If we move this circle close to the edge of the composition, it starts to create what's referred to as edge tension, which is increasing the visual weight of that element. With the left circle so close to the edge, it has more visual weight than the other circle, even though the circle on the right is much larger in scale. Ultimately, your eye will be the best judge to evaluate composition. However, it's good to know that a composition has physical tensions. This shows the forces in play with a composition. The eye wants to force objects towards the center. At the same time, when objects get too close to the edge, they start to carry too much visual weight. Let's look at one last example of asymmetrical balance. Looking at this print by Vasily Kandinsky, we see a lot of elements interacting with each other. The diagonal line in the lower left is balancing the blue diagonal line in the lower right. The horizontal lines to the upper right are carrying a lot of visual weight because of how close they are to the edge. The entirety of this image would be falling to the right if it wasn't for that little yellow circle on the top left. Look how much work that one little circle is doing to keep the composition balanced. Throughout this unit, we'll be building on these basic ideas that have just been introduced. We'll be looking at more complex ideas used by artists, as well as creating original works with balance and composition in mind.